In today's episode of the Dairyland Initiative podcast, we're going to be talking about how to get milk out of cows in robot dairies.
Hi, I'm Courtney Hallbach.
And I'm Nigel Cook,
And this is the Dairyland Initiative podcast,
where we get to discuss issues related to the housing and management of dairy cattle.
Let's dive in.
Well, how you doing, Courtney?
It's 2025, Dr. Cook.
It's our first recording in 2025, yeah?
Hopefully everybody else has watched episode 17 and that aired in 2025, but
It did.
we've had a nice long break
We have had a break, and we've come back reinvigorated.
and ready to re-record
Absolutely.
and start 2025 off right. So
That's what we're going to do.
we figured let's talk a little bit more about automated milking systems.
Yeah, we're going to stay on this theme for at least one more episode,
Yeah, and then I think it's time to move on.
and then it is time to move on.
AMS has been around in the United States now for 25 years.
Yeah, and certainly longer than that in Europe. So it's not new, but it's one of these areas that is rapidly growing at this point, related to some of the labour challenges that our farms are experiencing. And I think part of the challenge for the US dairy adopting robotics is that the robot manufacturers are largely European, and they've developed European models for success with this equipment. And in the US, we need more milk.
Yeah, our philosophy is a little bit different here,
Yeah.
and the way we manage cows. So
Yeah.
one of the biggest challenges with adopting AMS here in the United States has been trying to get higher production and adopting our philosophies that we've used in conventional herds to the AMS versus adopting the European AMS system.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're designing AMS systems here in the United States, we're hoping to achieve about 85 pounds or 39 kilos of milk per cow per day, with about an average milkings of 2.8 milkings per cow per day and a 5% fetch rate within the group.
And that was kind of the data that you got from your survey, yeah?
Yeah, so that came from our survey that we did in 2018, where I went and visited about 40 AMS herds throughout Wisconsin, some in Iowa, Minnesota, and Illinois. And we looked at what those farms were doing. We've also had the chance to work with dairies that are implementing new AMS facilities and have gone out and also retrofitted some and tried to troubleshoot. And so from those herd visits, we have come up with some key points that we think need to be implemented in these facilities in order to achieve that higher production.
Yeah, and our friends north of the border, they've done similar strategies to try to work out what's working for them. And so we'll refer to this study by Matson. This is our friends out in Guelph and other areas of Canada, visiting nearly 200 robotic units, little smaller than we visited, though. Ours were double this size. They averaged 110 cows. So these are usually sort of, two robot facilities. And they were averaging about 81 pounds, 37 kilos of milk. So a little lower than kind of what we were seeing in the upper Midwest. But they also put together and examine risk factors for milk production. So we'll refer to this study as we go along.
Yes. The first question that a lot of people ask us is, should I go with free, guided, or semi-guided flow traffic system? And there's pros and cons to each.
Yep.
We've covered those in a previous episode. But the research that is out there has shown increased milk production per cow in a free flow system versus a guided flow system. But I'd say that there's a caveat to this study.
Yeah, this was Marlene Tremblay's work, and this was a big data set that they obtained from Lely. And we know Lely has a preference for free flow. And so within this pretty big data set, there weren't that many guided flow herds. And if your preference is free flow, then how well were those guided flow herds designed and managed and so on. So I have some questions. Only 7% of the herds were guided flow. And I think our survey we went into it thinking, well, free flow is going to be a lot better than guided flow. And we left it a little bit less sure of that.
Yeah, we figured it really comes down to individual farm circumstances.
Yes.
And the design of the facility.
Yeah. And there is some, farmer philosophy in there as well that we'll touch on when we kind of tackle the feeding component to this.
So the previous studies that are out there, some from the University of Minnesota, looked at the differences in fetching rates and feeding rates between guided and free flow traffic systems. And what they found was that free flow systems tended to feed more pellets in the robots than the guided flow system.
Yep.
So obviously that comes with a little bit higher expense.
About 3 pounds of pellet per day, which is quite a bit.
Yep.
Yeah, quite a significant difference. And then a difference in fetch rate,
Yeah. But getting back to the feed, part of that philosophy with the free flow is that you are attracting cows to the robot through feeding versus with the guided, it's the gate.
There's a thought that you're doing that. I'm
Yes.
not sure the reality is such, but
no.
it's what the farmers think they're doing.
And that's reflected in what we see with how much pellet is fed in the robot between these two systems. But there is also a difference in fetch rates between free flow and guided, with people fetching on average about 8% of the cows in a free flow and 5% in a guided flow.
So if you're conscious of external feed costs and purchasing what is usually an expensive food product, and you're focused on limiting labor, then as a farmer you might well take a close look at guided flow. Within that, we still like that semi-guided hybrid flow option because it opens up the feed bunk without the cows having to go through the commitment pen and the robot to get to the bunk.
Yeah, and that semi-guided is where you have gates around the robot area, but the crossovers opposite of the robots are open. I know that there's kind of a newer design out there that is being called a semi or hybrid guided flow, where there are stalls in the feed lane, but that's not what we mean when we say guided.
The bottom line is, can the cows get to TMR when it's freshly delivered? And they can do that through the crossovers rather than have to go through a gate. Yeah. So this is some data from Victor Cabrera and Alex Bach, and they looked at feed and feed wastage, and the more robot pellet you feed, the more you waste. And so when they're looking at optimizing economic returns and minimizing variation in nutrient intake, they suggested pretty much a maximum of 4 kilos or 8.8 pounds of pellet per day as your sort of max to deliver through the robot.
Which is interesting, because what we were seeing in our survey, as well as the published research out of Minnesota,
we're exceeding that in the free flow herds. Yes, and we saw that in a herd investigation that we did with Doc Ertzel. So he always puts all these fancy graphs together for us. And this was a herd that was really having some problems with ketosis in early lactation, and potentially some subacute ruminal acidosis. And when we examined the feed allocation, concentrate allocation through the robot, they were really lead feeding. Remember that term, lead feeding, which is when you kind of lead production with concentrate allocation. So you can kind of see that in the graph on the right. If you're seeing this on YouTube or Spotify, that increase in allocation is much steeper than the increase in milk production. So that's the bit that we used to do in tie stalls, and we would get ruminal acidosis, ketosis problems as a result of that. And I think the risk is we're doing that in robot herds as well. And that, the big red line across at the what called the Bach Cabrera line, 8.8 pounds. Pretty much every cow in this herd was getting more than that.
Yeah.
And the allocation was again pretty high, because we're dealing with this philosophy of, one, chasing production, needing more milk, and 2, using the pellet allocation to attract the cow into the robot.
And so when we went out and did our survey here in the upper Midwest, the majority of our herds were free flow, about 66%,
Yep.
followed by guided flow, and then only a couple were the hybrid semi-guided flow systems. And we looked at the difference in production between the 3 systems, as well as how much feed they were allocating at the robot. And not surprising, very similar to the other published research that was out there, the free flow systems had higher milk production per cow per day, roughly 85 pounds of milk per cow, or 38, 39 kilos, whereas the guided flows were around 79 pounds, and hybrid was a little bit in between. But again, I can't say too much about the hybrid because there were only a couple
small
of
numbers, but
so,
they kind of performed as expected, as we thought they would. Free flow, about 6 pounds of milk more per cow per day, but also about 3 pounds of feed more. So at least some of that milk is coming from extra concentrate feed.
Yeah, and is it worth it? We haven't done the economic analysis on
Probably is. There's always a good return, but again, it comes back to that philosophical argument of how you want to manage and feed your cows. And there are things that you can feed in a robot that aren't as expensive as fancy robot pellets. Maize gluten feed and other types of product we've seen around the world. People cheapening the delivery of those feeds in the robots. But it is interesting to see how this interaction is occurring. Yes, the free flow is getting more milk, but they tend to be doing it with more feed in the robot.
Yeah, and that's not to say that other things can be done within the pen, like functional gating, better routing of cows around the robot to help drive visits to the robot so that we aren't relying just on feed allocation. Talking about feed, it's important to talk about bunk space and cows having access. A lot of these facilities early on had 3-4 rows of stalls, very similar to some of the barns that were built over in Europe, and we were trying to apply this system here in the States. And when you have 3-4 rows of stalls in a pen and only one feed bunk, you're really limited on feed bunk space.
Yeah, you're automatically going to be less than 20 inches of bunk per cow, and in some cases you'll be down to about 10.
Yeah.
So it can get ugly pretty quickly. So this gets back to that sort of philosophical robot cows do everything when they want to, that we've somewhat disproved a little bit for some cows, and really flies in the face of research done in conventional herds where a big driver for intake is fresh feed delivery, and for cows to be able to access the feed bunk when that fresh feed is delivered.
And we think that is just as important in AMS.
If you're chasing dry matter intake and performance and production, cows are cows. Yeah. If you stop them getting to fresh feed, ultimately they will eat a bit less. Can you compensate for that a little bit? Maybe. But we still view it as a limiting factor. And again, the strong preference for me still is for cows to access that fresh feed. And these 2 Canadian studies somewhat support our conventional wisdom of a little bit more bunk space is important, and it results in better performance. So in the 2 studies that they did up in Canada, averaging about 25 and 28 inches. In both studies, bunk space was linked to cow performance and milk production per cow.
And that bunk space, is typically coming from having 2 to 3 row pens, but then how we're laying out the robot also helps get us extra bunk space. So layouts that help facilitate additional bunk space would be the L shape, the crossway, and the toll booth or herringbone layouts.
And that's important to emphasize, because I think as a veterinarian listening to this, there's a knee-jerk that we've developed from conventional herds that we're going to shrink bunk space when we go with 3-row, and the only way to get the space we need is with a 2-row pen. That isn't necessarily the case with a robot dairy because of the space that the robot itself can take up, and also the crossover immediately in front.
Yeah, so we've got space in front of those robot rooms, but then typically we want to have the crossover where the robot is be at least 20 feet.
Or 6 meters, yeah.
That helps get us that extra bunk space. So even with a 3-row pen, which is typical in these layouts, we can get up to 24 inches of bunk space per cow. Once we have access to the feed bunk, we want to make sure that cows can actually eat. And so frequent push-ups are really important.
And again, we learn that in conventional herds, and the same philosophy applies to robot herds. Yeah.
And with the robot herds, a lot of them have robot feed pushers, and so you can be pushing up feed many times a day. And the study out of Canada found that increased feed push-ups also increased milk production.
Yeah, we're seeing this technology. It seems to be like when you buy your robot, they either force
part of the
you,
package deal.
They either force you to buy the little robot pusher, or it's such a great deal that you can't not take it at the time. So again, it fits in with the philosophy of staying out of the barn. You do have to watch these things. I mean, how they're set relative to the curb. We've had issues with that. They break down.
Yeah.
And the picture here shows this tiny little windrow of about a 2-inch wide column of feed at the end of the day, where this robot pusher's going up and down, and there's just no feed left to push, and so it's still out of reach of the cow. So a human being still has to check on this from time to time, but it does allow us to get 12 push-ups a day without too much hassle.
Which has a benefit on milk production.
Yeah.
We had to throw stalls.
Sand's still important,
sand
even in robots.
Yeah.
Well, this is Jim Sulphur's data from the University of Minnesota survey. Upper Midwest herds, not shocking because we know this. Yeah. Cows are less lame on deep bedding, particularly sand bedding. But it was shocking to see the amount of severe lameness in the mattress and waterbed herds.
Yeah, so they looked at lameness in sand, mattress, and waterbeds.
Yeah, and severe lameness about 2% on sand and nearly 11% on waterbeds, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And again, the worst thing you can have in a robot dairy is a lame cow.
Because she's not going to want to access the robot.
That's a fetch cow.
Yep.
That's work. It's a real problem.
But there was some resistance to go towards sand early on in these AMS builds.
Yeah, I think if I was selling a robot, the worst thing that could happen for me would be that the producer says, and I want to use sand bedding, because they would think, all the damage it's going to cause on my nice shiny new robot.
And the earlier versions of these robots weren't built for sand.
No, not particularly well.
Because sand wasn't being used in Europe.
Again, a European model with a lot of slatted floors.
Yep.
And I don't really like slatted floors, cause a lot of hoof injury, so sand bedding precludes slatted floors, and I don't care. That's a good thing for me. It does require, if we're using automatic scrapers, a sort of collapsing V-shaped scraper arm so that you can drive a little skid steer or whatever in for your sand delivery, because you don't want to do this by hand.
Yep.
So you can kind of drive over the scraper pretty easily. And then sand does get everywhere.
Yep.
And so your robot machine has to cope with some challenges. And the things that have emerged over time in the Lely units has been the wear over the pulleys and the nylon retractor cables. I've had to change the pulley system, change the chains and things like that. The sand scratching the
lenses on
the lens,
cameras,
the camera lens on the older Delaval units, not so much the new ones because they use, I think, sapphire glass now. Fancy stuff. And then the gear unit, because there are so many sort of valves on the way from the teacup to the receiver, I do still have some concerns about how those valves hold up with wear and sand. So there are issues, but I think what we've learned from the industry is they're not insurmountable.
No.
They're manageable.
They are manageable. And There are a couple of herds that we visited that are manually scraping sand out of the stalls, but the preferred option would be these automated scrapers because we're not moving cows out of the stalls in these AMS herds.
For those able to see the pictures, there's a couple of barns here with this collapsing V-shaped scraper so that you can see you can drive heavy equipment into that alleyway and deliver your sand. It's an absolute requirement to be able to do that because, again, you do not want to deliver sand by hand.
We found that about 60% of the herds in our study have implemented sand. I think everybody that either had a freestall facility before moving to robots had sand already, so they just needed to have the robot
I think the
adapt.
difference was the tie stall barns, because
Yes.
most of our tie stall barns had mats and mattresses, and they went into robots and they just stayed with what they knew and put mats and mattresses into their freestall barns, and that doesn't work as well.
Nope.
So I think there was a difference there in terms of the prior history of the farm and the choices they were making.
We looked at how stall base played a role in milk production, and not surprisingly, sand or deep manure bedded stall herds had higher milk production than those that were on mattresses or water beds. The deep bedded herds were averaging about 86 pounds or 39 kilos of milk per cow per day, whereas the mattresses and water beds were down at about 78, 79 pounds. And thankfully, there was published research that also showed something similar.
Yeah, the Canadians, I'll say they might not, we have the best sand herds anywhere. I mean, they really do manage it well. But they still, they still lucked out because they're still up 3.3 pounds in that survey. Bigger survey and more robust, I think, than our smaller scale survey. So I'll give them that.
Okay, but yeah, bottom line is stall base does have an impact on increased milk production in AMS herds. Then we come across ventilation challenges. We're putting rooms up now in the middle of these barns.
Rooms?
Well, robot rooms.
Robot rooms.
And
Big
it blocks
big
airflow.
obstructions to airflow, yeah.
Yeah.
We think that's bad. Yeah. For survivors of our 20 podcasts on ventilation.
Boring.
We think blocking airflow is bad, and it's easy to do that in a robot facility.
Yeah, and there was like a strange thought early on too that we did not want to make the area around the robots that desirable for cows, so people were
there was some
hesitant
notion to get cows through the robot. You don't want to make things too comfortable around there. Get them focused on getting in and out.
Yeah, so people weren't putting fans up around these robot rooms.
Yeah, we don't like that.
Yeah, we've moved away from that.
We're going to put fans around everywhere.
We would recommend putting recirculation fans to improve airflow around those robot rooms, especially where the rooms are blocking airflow in a mechanical system. And then thinking about putting outlets and inlets in strategic places so as not to create wind shadows.
Yeah, you can put inlets around the robot room if it's on the side of the barn, or you could use positive pressure fans either side of the robot room to push air into the space where you're getting a wind shadow from that blockage of airflow. So there's lots of things you can do, and I think a lot of farmers will want to always point fans in the direction of airflow. And when you've got a big robot room just blocking everything, just throw that out. Just stick a fan in perpendicular, above, below. It doesn't matter. Just get airflow into that space.
Yeah. And then in our tunnel ventilated facilities, we like to put the robot rooms closer to the exhaust and have that inlet located closer to the pen so that we're getting the fresh air.
Have the inlet the opposite end of, or as furthest away from the robot rooms as you can.
The study out of Canada also
They agreed with us.
Yeah, they considered ventilation and
We
circulation
love it.
fans.
We love it.
I don't know how that, like,
But
just great minds
basically,
think alike.
this study said that if you just hang a fan in a barn,
Even if it's a naturally ventilated barn and you just put a fan up.
Yeah, this is not just mechanical ventilation. It's assisted using fans to create airspeed. And we talked about that at length, putting fans over the stall. But this is the biggest effect in this survey. I mean, this is a big chunk of milk.
It was 6 to 9 pounds per day.
Yeah, hang a fan. It's good.
that more than compensates for the cost of running and installing that fan.
And remember, folks, this is Canada. It's not Florida. It's heat stress is impacting us pretty much everywhere now. So this ventilation business, it's important.
Where do fresh cows go in a robot herd?
Well, in a conventional herd, pretty much 100% of our conventional herds have a fresh pen now.
Yep.
Yep. So
and
it
they're
has
there
become
for average 21 days.
Yeah, it's become part of our management, and I think a successful part. And when we visited these robot dairies, they don't do that.
Fresh cows were immediately going into the main milking cow pen, and we questioned their performance. So we asked the farms what they were doing, and for cows, they would go into the main milking pen anywhere from 0 to 30 days, but on average about 6 days.
But more than a third of the herds, day one, they were in with the rest of the lactating cows, and that included heifers.
Yes.
Yeah.
And only 7% of the herd separated cows for 14 days or more.
So then you hear lots of angst from farmers about, well, they'll get used to that robot and there'll be a problem with milk production when they go into the next pen, and they get worried about robots that enter from the left versus the right. And we can only say the 3 herds that we had that did this for a conventional amount of time, 14 days, were amongst the highest producing, yeah?
Yes. Now our philosophy might be a little bit different in a robot herds because we have more technology that
we have
is
more data, yeah,
checking up on how those cows are doing. So they may be able to enter the milking pen sooner than what we typically do in conventional.
No problem with that situation when the cows attending the robot, milking well, day 9, day 10, day 11, whatever it is, make the transition. But equally, if you've got an animal that isn't performing particularly well, we need a space to hold them in an area where they don't have to compete so much.
Mm-hmm. And so there is a little bit of frustration around how you build to accommodate fresh cows for longer periods of time without having to constantly go in and fetch them. And so that's why we advocate for thinking about how you lay out the robot so that you can give fresh cows 24/7 access.
Yeah.
And so typically there would be a robot that's shared between a sort pen as well as the main milking cow pen that gives access to that secondary group when they want, so that somebody doesn't have to go in and fetch them 2 to 3 times a day.
Yeah. And the Finns call this the very important cow pen. So our friends at 4D Barn have coined that term. In our parlance, it's still a fresh cow pen or a special needs pen, but that's the idea. In design, create a situation where 24/7 those cows have access to a robot.
And typically these pens also allow 1 stall per cow and oodles of bump space.
It's a smaller pen. You've got more space. They're under less pressure. They can make that adaptation a little easier.
And we believe that helps them adjust to milking in the robot.
Exactly. Data on heifer performance, so we just talked about transition. It's the heifers that struggle with transition, and we talked about that last time with waiting time and those heifers learning how to access the robot. We've seen some evidence that is impacting their performance in robotic dairies, and this is another group study from the Minnesota research team. Really nice study showing that we have lower peaks in our first lactation animals compared to the older cows. And so when we look at things like peak ratio, we expect the heifer peak to be about 75% of the mature cow peak. And in these robot herds, we're less than that, which means that the heifers are relatively underperforming. And so I think that fits with this discussion of feeding, transitioning, and robot attendance that is almost number one concern for managers of robot dairies, is how much effort do I have to do, how many times do I have to fetch those heifers.
And so there are some ways to help heifers transition to a robot facility. It's not intuitive for them to push against a gate. And
exactly.
So,
yeah. I mean, that was pointed out by Yoni from 4D Barn. Normally, if there's a gate and you're a heifer in a heifer rearing pen,
you can't go there.
You can't go there. Yeah. And suddenly, when they calve, you're expecting a heifer to push against this tilt gate to access the robot. Well, they're only going to do that if they learn that can happen. Mm-hmm. And so some of the heifer training pens, have gone whole hog, and they've got like a robot box that just allow the heifers to go into a box type arrangement at the end of the pen.
And they may have some pellets in there.
Yep. You can get a little bit of feeding, so they get used to that. Or some just have a tilt gate, just a gate that they have to push against to get to the feed bunk.
That somebody runs them through the pen. Now that we're in the United States, we have larger AMS herds, which has allowed these herds to have a separate pen for first lactation heifers.
Usually at around 3 robots that works out. So if about a third of your herd is heifers, then you need around about 150 milking cows. So it's usually a 3 robot dairy that we can start talking about having a dedicated first lactation heifer pen. Mm-hmm. And once you've made that decision, then you can maybe stock that at a little lower rate. You can maybe put some in better lighting or some adaptations to the robot entry area, just again to help transition these heifers. We talk about raising heifers, and that'll be the topic of future episodes, but pair raising, group raising does lead to a more sort of inquisitive, maybe a little smarter animal. Maybe they can develop and adapt to this situation a little bit better. Quicker. So I think farmers are looking for all these types of solutions to really tackle what is one of the major challenges of robot dairying. And, we've experienced really some challenges with this related to metabolic disease. So this was a herd investigation where a lot of animals were getting ketosis, and I mean like 60%.
Jeez.
So this is one of the highest prevalences of ketosis I'd ever seen. And it's a reminder that, every time those animals are being put in the robot, they're usually getting some concentrate feed, some pellet feed.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, this farm was heavily pushing heifers through the robot.
They were being pretty aggressive. They've been sold that concept of you've got to fetch heifers, you've got to get them used to doing this. And I think carried that on through lactation 1, lactation 2 as well. And we were seeing pretty high rates of robot attendance in the first week or so after calving. And I think along with that, high intakes of pellet and high levels of ketosis. Mm-hmm. And we know reducing the milking frequency can actually reduce the pressure on energy demand in that critical period. And so we have a slightly different philosophy. Design is absolutely key.
Yep.
So design, not feed, drives robot visits. So making that robot entry area accessible and free and well designed so that the animal can attend. And absolutely do not overfeed concentrates in early lactation. Nope. We've learned too many times that that's bad. So, help your heifers by coaching them a little bit through the rearing period. And then when they calve,
take a step back.
You can fetch them, but
limit it to
maybe
2 times.
1 or 2 times a day, not 3 or 4 times a day. Yeah. Certainly in that first 5 or 6 days in milk. So don't overdo it there.
Mm-mm. We've talked about how functional design with gating and sorting helps drive robot visits, and thinking about how we lay out those robots so that we can give priority access to a secondary group that may have heifers or fresh cows, and design the pen so that cows that are exiting the robot are going away from cows that are waiting to be milked.
The diagram we're showing here in the background is a Yoni Pitcairn original. I have this framed, but
and signed.
This is hand drawn. It's whole booth robot layout, and there's lots of little arrows. Thinking about how do you get a cow from the robot to a trim chute? How do you get the cows through a foot bath? How do you sort the cow to a treatment pen?
And really thinking about how does an individual do this?
Yes, how does one person arrange the gating such that they can do that? So minimize labor, maximize performance. So I kind of love this thought process that you go through before you build this darn thing, and put some planning and thought into those things that you're going to do to manage cows.
And the farms that have implemented a lot of gates here in the U.S. are actually really happy with it because one person can do it. They're not relying on others.
They do look a little different. They're busy. There's a lot of gates,
and it's a little overwhelming, and the sticker shock might be
but when you start working in it and realize the things that you can do without having to get dad out of bed and the three kids and grandpa and two people from down the road to help sort a cow, labor efficiency is the reason we're doing this. So some thought to one person management is really key.
Some factors that we saw overall in increasing milk production in AMS units is those higher feed push-ups, more bunk space per cow, having deep sand or manure beds. No surprise there.
No surprise.
And then
better ventilation. Yeah, so those are the things from these 200 Canadian herds that they found, plus the Holstein breed. So a black and white cow is going to make more sense. So two feed-related things, two comfort-related things.
Fits in with the Dairyland Initiative.
It really does, doesn't it? Yeah. And it really tells us that the things that we've learned from our conventional herds are applicable to these robot dairies.
Going back now over the years, Dr. Cook, 2016 when you did this survey, and it's...
Oh, I can't believe it.
Almost 10
Fresh
years.
in my mind.
Oh, yeah. Well, the herds that you visited...
They were killing it. They were absolutely marching on. 90 pounds of milk average, a bunch of these herds were over 100 at the time.
Doing everything right.
Yeah, 70% deep bedding, doing a lot of things that we've talked about, and 13% lameness overall, 11 in the sand-bedded ones. So we showed you could have this high performance and that lameness and disease wasn't, a natural consequence of that. You could have low rates of lameness. And the survey of AMS units in the upper Midwest from the Minnesota group told a different story, which was really disappointing at the time.
It's almost like the AMS herds went backwards instead of forwards.
They were averaging, this is a study published in 2018, but they were averaging 75 pounds of milk, which isn't going to pay for that robot.
And high lameness, 25% lameness.
25% lameness, almost double the rate of lameness, which for me, having committed, a career to preventing lameness, to be building barns with state-of-the-art technology and going backwards in terms of lameness was kind of tough.
But when you looked at what those farms were doing in this AMS study, they had more slatted floors. They weren't scraping manure manually. They weren't foot bathing
Not foot bathing very much.
And feeding had changed.
But the big one is only a third of them were deep bedding. And that... For whatever reason, Courtney, because you visited similar herds, a lot of the same herds.
Only a few years later.
And
yet, in my survey, there were about 60% of the herds had deep bedding. So I think people learned from those that had already implemented AMS and knew that in order to get higher milk production, they needed to turn to deep bedding. And
these herds were getting higher production. These herds were averaging 85 pounds, 39 kilos.
So still not quite at the conventional
level. Not quite there, but some of the herds
Closer.
were. Some of the herds were really soaring at this point. So We're going to revisit, some of the choices being made and make those comparisons between conventional and robot dairies. But my philosophy is what we've learned over the last several decades in conventional herds. It's a safe bet to apply it to a robot dairy.
No doubt.
You won't be disappointed.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry if you've suffered now for about 40 minutes listening us drone on about AMS performance.
There's no droning. It's been quite entertaining, I thought, Courtney.
You could have just skipped to this very last
Oh, we could just do the summary here.
Yeah, here's the summary. Our recipe for success for AMS facilities. And we really want to focus on not overstocking the robots and ideally having 55 to 60 cows
in terms of
per
not
robot.
overstocking relative to stalls, but in a robot case, not overstocking relative to the robot.
Correct. And having 2-3 MS robots within a pen so that
choice, and that's a US thing. We're building bigger herds, so we can have multi-robot pens, bigger pens.
In terms of traffic system, we have no preference. They comes with their pros and cons, and as we discussed in this episode, differences in fetch rates as well as feeding allocation in the robots. And then no matter what, provide a minimum of 24 inches of bunk space per cow so that
60 centimeters.
All cows can access the feed bunk when fresh feed is delivered.
Yep.
You want to say the next one? This one's yours.
Deep loose bedding. Use a bit of that sand, and don't forget ventilation, providing that minimum cooling airspeed in the resting area and adequate air exchange.
Thinking about those cows that need a little bit of extra help getting used to the robots, fresh cows, giving them a dedicated pen that they can be in for anywhere from 10 to 21 days.
Yep.
And thinking about those heifers as well. So having a separate pen or at least training them before they are introduced to the robot.
Absolutely. And then some thought to functional gating and animal movement for one person to be able to do lots of things in this herd.
And last
finally,
but not least...
the old foot bath.
Foot baths. I have an inkling that that's going to be on our next episode, Dr.
We've got to think about management of the foot bath in these robot dairies. You can't just default to, the cows might walk through it in a crossover and cross your fingers. So that seems worthy of a podcast in itself. Being able to guide cows through a foot bath as they leave the robot will be the significant element that we'll add to this, and we'll dedicate a podcast to.
All right, I'm looking forward to it, Dr. Cook.
Oh, me too.
Thanks much for joining us.
Thanks.
The Dairyland Initiative is supported by industry leaders who are advancing cow comfort worldwide. We would like to say a special thank you to our premier sponsor, Saputo, who is providing the global community with high-quality dairy products made from high-quality milk from healthy and well-cared-for animals. We'd also like to say thank you to our other sponsors, SaveCows.com, Zinpro, GPS Dairy Consulting, 40 Barn, Sure Gain Trow Nutrition, Munters, J&D Manufacturing, VES Artex, Ventec, and Kestrel Instruments. Thanks for tuning in to the Dairyland Initiative podcast. Want more Dairyland Initiative? Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, follow us on our socials, and visit our website for all of the latest recommendations in dairy cattle housing and management. See you next time.